Imagine standing on a frozen lake in the dead of winter 1242, knowing that beneath your feet lies 4 feet of ice, and certain death if it breaks. Now imagine 2,500 men are about to charge across that ice in full armor, and you're one of them. The temperature hovers around -15 degrees. Your breath crystallizes instantly, and somewhere in that advancing wall of steel and horseflesh are warrior monks who've spent decades perfecting one singular skill: killing. This is Lake Peipus, a vast frozen wasteland stretching between what we now call Estonia and Russia. But on April 5th, 1242, it became an arena where East and West would settle their differences, not with words, but with blood frozen solid before it could stain the ice. On one side stood the Teutonic Knights, Germanic warrior monks encased in metal, mounted on war horses bred specifically to carry their crushing weight. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were the shock troops of the Northern Crusades, men who'd taken monastic vows of poverty and chastity while simultaneously becoming Europe's most feared killing machines. They'd spent 25 years crushing pagan Baltic tribes, burning villages, forcing conversions at sword point. They answered only to the Pope himself. Facing them across the ice stood something they didn't expect: organized resistance that wouldn't simply collapse at the sight of their legendary cavalry charge. Leading this resistance was a 21-year-old prince named Alexander Nevsky, just recalled from exile by the same people who'd banished him months earlier. Why the sudden change of heart? Because the alternative was worse than pride. It was extinction. But here's what makes this confrontation truly unprecedented. Both sides were Christian. This wasn't pagans versus crusaders. This was a civil war within Christendom itself. Orthodox East versus Catholic West, and the winner would determine which version of Christianity would dominate Eastern Europe for centuries to come. The Teutonic Knights weren't just invading territory. They were attempting to erase an entire branch of Christian civilization and replace it with their own. Let's rewind 2.5 decades to understand how we reached this frozen apocalypse. Since 1217, the Teutonic Knights had been waging systematic warfare across the Baltic, subduing Prussia's pagan tribes with methodical brutality. Castle by castle, village by village, they built an empire. Then in 1237, Pope Gregory IX made a chess move that changed everything. But he dissolved a rival order called the Sword Brothers and handed their Livonian territories to the Teutonic Knights. Suddenly, these warrior monks controlled virtually the entire eastern Baltic coast. But the Pope wanted payment for this gift, and his price was simple: conquer Novgorod. Now, Novgorod wasn't some backwater settlement. It was a prosperous merchant republic that had dominated the region for generations, exercising control over Estonian and Latvian territories that the Teutonic Knights now occupied. For years, border clashes had escalated. Novgorod watched its former tributary states fall under Western control. The republic's prince, Yaroslav, even led a massive retaliatory raid in 1234 that devastated Latin Christian missions in Finland, killing missionaries and burning churches. Pope Gregory IX decided that missionaries were no longer sufficient. He wanted submission, and he dispatched orders to the Teutonic Knights: launch a full crusade to conquer Novgorod and force its conversion to Latin Christianity. Here's the thing: the Teutonic Order didn't particularly want another war. Their forces were already stretched impossibly thin, manning dozens of castles across Livonia while simultaneously prosecuting ongoing campaigns in Prussia. Adding another front meant potential disaster, but 1240 seemed like the perfect window of opportunity. Why? Because Novgorod was tearing itself apart from within. Prince Alexander, Yaroslav's son, was locked in brutal power struggles with rival Russian princes. After defeating a Swedish invasion, earning him the nickname Nevsky after the Neva River battle, Alexander's own subjects exiled him in a fit of political insanity. The young prince who'd just saved them was forced into banishment, while enemies gathered at the gates. The Teutonic Knights struck immediately. September 1240, they occupied Izborsk. Shortly after, Pskov fell. By early 1241, they'd captured Vod and Ingria, territories dangerously close to Novgorod itself. Imagine being a Novgorod citizen watching this Western war machine devour your frontier towns one after another, while your savior prince remained in exile because of political squabbling. Finally, terror overcame pride. Novgorod citizens begged Alexander to return and save them from what now seemed like inevitable conquest. Alexander Nevsky answered the call, but he didn't come back with promises of immediate salvation. He came back with a plan, and that plan required patience his people didn't think they had. Instead of gathering a massive army for a direct confrontation, Alexander initially led small mobile forces to disrupt Teutonic operations. He hit their garrison at Koporia and expelled them. He occupied roads leading to Pskov, cutting supply lines. He even penetrated deep into Dorpat diocese, the heartland of Latin control, conducting raids that demonstrated something crucial to both sides. The Novgorodians could fight back. But then Alexander overextended. A contingent of Western knights under Bishop Herman of Dorpat, one of Livonia's most powerful magnates, as much warrior prince as religious leader, caught the Novgorodians in a vulnerable position and routed them. Alexander was forced to retreat and reconsider his strategy. This setback actually proved fortunate because it gave Alexander time to gather Novgorod's full military strength while teaching him valuable intelligence about Western tactics and leadership. Bishop Herman, meanwhile, assembled his own army in coordination with the Teutonic Order, determined to crush this upstart prince once and for all. By April 1242, two armies stood facing each other, and Alexander made a decision that would prove decisive. He chose the battlefield. Being the defender fighting on his own territory gave him this crucial advantage, and he selected Lake Peipus with brilliant strategic insight. Alexander understood that the Teutonic Knights' greatest weapon, their devastating heavy cavalry charge, required solid ground to generate the momentum that made them unstoppable. What would happen to that charge on a frozen lake? The ice was thick enough to support men and horses, but it was also slippery, unpredictable, and psychologically terrifying. Horses couldn't generate the same explosive acceleration. Knights couldn't maneuver with their usual precision, and everyone knew that if the ice broke beneath them, drowning in freezing water while wearing 60 pounds of armor meant certain death. Think about the psychological warfare here. The Teutonic Knights had built their reputation on an irresistible cavalry charge that broke enemy formations through sheer kinetic force. Now they faced fighting on terrain that neutralized their primary advantage while amplifying every risk. Meanwhile, Alexander's larger, lighter forces could maneuver more easily on the ice, and his troops were accustomed to brutal Russian winters. The Westerners were about to learn that environmental adaptation matters as much as martial skill. Let's talk numbers, because understanding the scale reveals just how calculated this gamble was. Bishop Herman and his Teutonic allies brought approximately 2,500 men, literally everything they could spare without abandoning their castles in Livonia and Prussia. The core of this force consisted of roughly 1,000 Estonian infantry, several hundred German and Danish mounted knights, and the crown jewel? About 100 heavily armored brother knights of the Livonian branch of the Teutonic Order. These brother knights were the elite of the elite, men who'd survived years of continuous warfare, wearing the best armor money could buy, riding horses worth more than most peasants would earn in a lifetime. Across the frozen lake, Alexander commanded approximately 5,000 troops, a 2-to-1 numerical advantage that was absolutely crucial to his strategy. On his flanks, he positioned his own cavalry retinue, Novgorod's finest warriors, men who'd trained their entire lives for mounted combat. His center consisted primarily of Novgorod's militia troops, supplemented by Alexander's personal infantry. Not professional soldiers like the Teutonic Knights, but determined men fighting to defend their homes and families. On his right flank, Alexander placed a small but critical contingent of horse archers, light cavalry equipped with composite bows, capable of harassing enemies from distance. Alexander arranged his forces in a solid defensive formation and did something that must have seemed insane to observers. He waited. He didn't advance. He didn't maneuver. He simply stood there on the ice, letting the Teutonic Knights see his numbers, letting them contemplate charging across slippery ice toward an army twice their size, letting winter wind and sub-zero temperatures work on their morale. This waiting game was psychological warfare of the highest order. Bishop Herman faced an impossible choice. Retreat meant admitting defeat without fighting, undermining Teutonic prestige and abandoning the Pope's crusade. But attacking meant charging uphill, metaphorically speaking, against superior numbers on unfavorable terrain.